So just very quickly, in the morning session, I explained that the basic view that I'm starting from is one in which Buddha is an all-knowing, all-compassionate being, and that the path to Buddhahood is one in which you have to cultivate, beginning with reasoning and logic, very clear, specific, conceptual understandings of how things exist conventionally, such as people and their suffering, for example, which can be the basis for practicing compassion, and also combine that with an understanding of how ultimately all things are empty, and thereby liberate yourself from ignorance, not knowing, which is the root of cyclic existence. And then, having explained that, I was talking about how Joan Halifax, in her book Being with Dying, trains hospice workers on the basis for her Zen understanding, in which the first tenet is not knowing, and that this not knowing seems to involve a lot of different, from my point of view, overlapping concepts, such as not having preconceptions about a situation, but also somehow dropping all concepts altogether, and in some way seems to connect us to our fundamental Buddha nature or Buddha mind from her point of view. And so I was just sort of puzzling over that, thinking about how we could think about that because of it being so different from, well, for me, being different from what I was used to before. And now what I'm going to do in this part is talk about how, Roshi Joan Halifax is part of a tradition in Zen, that it isn't anomalous, or strange that she talks about not knowing, that this is a deeply rooted thing in the Chan Zen tradition. And I want to just explore a little bit about that, and then we'll be able to go on. And the questions. So people had questions still left at the end the last time, but what I was thinking is that I'll just talk about this, and we'll try to stop cleanly by 4 o'clock, and I don't know if that will leave room to come back to questions today or not. But if it doesn't, or if it does, either way, we'll have more time for questions tomorrow, because the schedule's going to be a lot more open in the later part of the day. Because tonight, then, Venerable Chodron is giving another teaching, and everything has to be fit in around that. Okay. All right. So, Roshi Joan Halifax, as I said, her teacher was she had 3 teachers in Buddhism, but the teacher who gave her transmission as a Roshi was Bernie Glassman, whose teacher was Maizumi Roshi, whose lineages he has like Soto and Rinzai transmissions. So his lineages can be traced, of course, back into China, back to all the ancestors of Chan Buddhism. And it seems that Chan Buddhism emerged in China as a distinctive thing, roughly 1,500 years ago. According to Chan Buddhism, it traces itself further back to the teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha. But then that's not, possible to independently verify apart from the Chan tradition of that it's in other words, we can't have any archaeology or literary records that show some kind of Chan thing that was going on in India. So this is what I want to start to talk about, is like that the Buddhist tradition, our tradition, exists in history. I mean, it's pointing to things like impermanence that are similar in the time of Alexander the Great till now, right? But pointing at it, it points in different ways, and different accents change from one syllable to the other, and people, different kinds of, just like, there's different medicines in Dr. Buddha's Dharma pharmacy, there's some countries and some times where some of these medicines and some of these ways of talking seem to come more to the forefront and be more valuable or the people at least feel they're more appropriate for them. So anyway, my point is that Buddhism as a tradition is impermanent. It changes over time. Not you can say the Dharma to which the tradition is referring is not, but impermanent. But the tradition itself is impermanent, and so therefore it's historically contingent. It's variable in different places and times. Ideas are passed down orally or by text or by YouTube nowadays, from generation to generation, and podcasts and so forth, and it's just inevitable that each generation, just like every person, will hear what's being passed down through their own ears, which aren't exactly the same kind of ears culturally that the people had before. So it's Buddhism as a tradition is a cultural tradition that includes ethical values, meditative practices, philosophical insights, and institutions like the Sangha that we're very fortunate to inherit, along with other things in our culture that we value, like scientific method for discovering antibiotics, and the idea that women are not inferior beings, which emerged as a historical change in culture too, right? So the other word for woman in Tibetan, right, is like inferior being. It's like so. Buddhism has changed, and we each read and receive the tradition in our own distinctive way to some extent. And I would say like this: it doesn't mean you could just make up whatever you want and call it the Buddha Dharma. We aren't really seriously practicing the Dharma unless we engage with the received Buddhist teachings and the traditional practices and allow them to challenge our own presuppositions and prejudices about, say, material possessions, sexual behavior, what it might mean to live a good life, how things exist, and allow it to be, because the Dharma goes against the grain, and so we should expect it to be challenging, not just catering to our own predispositions or prejudices. But nonetheless, whether we intend to do so or not, I believe that we selectively, creatively discover which parts of the Dharma pharmacy are best tipping the scales toward peace in our own hearts. And an example of that would be the other day when we were watching the PowerPoint about the Vinaya, the woman who I don't remember her name again, Diane Finnegan, she used the phrase politics of representation. Politics of representation, which she described as being that it's like a reporter who's there and is saying, this is what happened, and then writes it down. They can't help but select certain things. They can't tell you every single thing that happened with every single person every single second. So when they tell what the true story, it's a true story that selects certain things and then knits them together in a narrative, right? It's not, it's not like a video of, all right? Or even if it would be from a point of view. You had to set up the camera someplace, and that leaves something out, right? So that's what she's calling the politics of representation. It's not like she's saying that there's something bad about it. Her point was that it's inevitable, even when people are doing their best to make an accurate representation. Another really good example of this in my life is syllabus creation, because I'm a professor of Buddhism, right? So some people, maybe when they're starting out to teach and they haven't thought about it enough, think that they will cover the subject within this. And then they quickly find out that this is like laughable, right? And that what always happens, and as always has happened, is that you're picking certain things to talk about. Should I talk about women renunciates in Thailand? Should I talk about funerals in Sri Lanka? Should I talk about exorcism in Tibet? Should I talk about, obviously you're going to talk about the Three Jewels and the Four Noble Truths, but then, what else are you going to pick out to exemplify this and to talk about it, and not, or what are you going to leave out? There's only so many hours that you have to speak with the students. They can't learn, not only can they not learn everything about Buddhism, they can't even learn a small portion of what the instructor knows in the semester. When I was fresh out of graduate school, like a lot of people fresh out of graduate school, we try to like force feed the students like everything that we knew, and then they get very unhappy, and it's unskillful, right? So you have to like own up to the fact that I'm going to pick certain things to not teach you, even though they're really important, so that we can teach some other things, and you'll actually have a chance to learn them before the semester is over. You know what I'm saying? It's like, yeah, I'm going to pick, right? And then once you know that this is inevitable and it's your job to pick as the representer of Buddhism on that particular occasion, then you have to, think about what's the process for deciding which kinds of things to pick. And so that's what I'm thinking of, is like, if you think about that in syllabus creation, it also applies in, Buddhist text creation, trying to reflect what the tradition was. You always have to pick something, and that keeps going generation after generation. So we know that when the Dharma, before the Dharma came to Tibet, it had already been changing. And when it came to Tibet, of course, it changed in new ways that reflected its expression within the context of the distinctive culture of Tibet. And the same thing as Buddhism coming to the West. I was going to say it takes on new cultural flavor, but then I thought maybe we say more new cultural flavors. It's not really clear exactly what Buddhism in the West is going to look like yet, but it seems to be more than one thing. So of course, this is what I'm leading to. Of course, when Buddhism went to China, it took a particular form of expression that was workable in the context of Chinese culture. It was flavored, and in the case of China, it was very different from other places Buddhism has gone up until Buddhism came to the West, because almost everywhere place Buddhism went, it came along with literacy, and everybody said, "Oh, writing, that's so cool. The Buddhists have it," and so that was like a huge advantage, and. But of course, when Buddhism came to the West, there was no such advantage. And the time that happened before was when Buddhism went to China. China had not only had literacy, but they'd had it a long time, and they had philosophical literature. It was a very well developed, philosophical and literary culture. And so they pretty much thought that they already knew everything, sort of like people in the West. Right? And that they were the center of the universe. Actually, that was the name of their country, was the central country, right? And everybody else out in the outlying areas. And very similar to the kind of cultural arrogance that we see in the West, right? Yeah, it's a remarkable parallel. And so in that case, there's a different kind of, there's less of an advantage, because you're not bringing the powerful technology of literacy along with you, as an ace in the hole, so to speak. In this particular case, what I'm trying to get around to saying is that I think that the Chanzen tradition is Buddhism. I'm not going to say that it's not Buddhism. I think it's a legitimate form of Buddhism. I'm going to tomorrow sort of flesh out how some of these ideas, have roots in India as well. But this whole thing of not knowing and don't know mind and so forth, really to me seems it's irresistible to my mind to conclude that this way of expressing the Dharma comes from China, not from India. And so we can start with the two, if we start with the two founding stories, the founding narratives that Chan and Zen tells about itself, right? Which we can't magically go back in time machine and see if they really happen. But these are the crucial stories that are the basis of the tradition, right? One is that Bodhidharma came before the Emperor Wu of Liang dynasty. And this is, by the way, if you have the handout, unfortunately it seems like a couple people don't now, but the material that I'm going to be looking at now is sequential, sections 6 through 14, depending on how far we get. So the first thing is the first case from the Blue Cliff record. Koan collection tells this story. The Emperor Wu of Liang asked the great master Bodhidharma, what is the first principle of the holy Dharma? And Bodhidharma said, vast emptiness, nothing holy. And the emperor said, who stands before me? And Bodhidharma said, I don't know. Interesting choice of words, right, given our topic here today, right? This is how the Dharma came to China according to the tradition. So anyway, then there's a follow-up where, the emperor has a religious advisor who, yeah, I wanted to read this. So the emperor did not understand. Bodhidharma left, went up to the north part of China, crossed the Yangtze, and later the emperor took up the matter with his religious advisor, Duke Zhi. And Duke Zhi said, Your Majesty, do you know who that was? And the emperor said, I don't know. And I was like, so apparently there's a good I don't know and a bad I don't know. And it seems, I never noticed that until this time through, that there's two I don't knows in this story. And they have the opposite meaning. Right. Anyway, so this is like a basic starting point. And then, of course, that even before that, the purported to be first Zen master, Shakyamuni Buddha, is supposed to have started the tradition by gathering a large group of people, expecting to hear the Dharma expounded, but then not speaking and only holding up a flower. Well, at least initially not speaking and just holding up a flower. This relates to what I was saying earlier about darkness. And so silence is the auditory equivalent of darkness, right? Silence and darkness are our two primary sense equivalents of not knowing, saying there's nothing I can say, there's nothing that one can see because it's dark. So I understand this kind of silence as another exhibition of the inexpressibility. It could be like, well, the Buddha doesn't know what to say because there isn't anything that can be said that expresses the Dharma just as it is, right? And then here it just holds up the flower. I've tried this in front of a class before, just hold up something and see how long you can be quiet. It's like, it's amazing, the pressure to speak that develops. It's like, it's hard to be silent in that situation. I'm thinking, that took the power of a Buddha to sit there, with all these people staring at him, not saying anything. Yeah. So, of course, Dogen is great, Zen master, 13th century Japan, always likes to make the point that the Buddha did speak on that occasion, because after Mahakāssyapa smiled, indicating that he got it, whatever that it was, then he opened his mouth and said, oh, there's a supreme Dharma that words cannot teach, and I have just handed that to Kāssyapa. So the point of Dogen is that, this is not a word-free teaching of the Dharma. It has two parts to it, the non-word part and the word part, where it is at the conventional level made clear to everyone that there is something that's inexpressible. Right? Do you see my point? It wasn't like he just never spoke at all. Right? That's Dogen's point. He thought of that. That's, I think, very cool. Okay. So various Zen teachers since then in the tradition have talked about either the basis of things or the primary practice, or under different names, sometimes the goal, in terms of not knowing. Sometimes, I think you have to say that this is not a peripheral thing. I'm not stretching to make this up. I mean, it's just all over the place once you start looking for it. And number 7, I have this, number 7 on page 3, another koan. The young monk Fayan visited the master Ditsang, who asked, where have you come from? And Fayan says, well, I wander from here to there on my pilgrimage. And Ditsang said, well, what's the point of your pilgrimage? And Fayan said, I don't know. And Ditsang, instead of saying, what's the matter with you, dude, said, not knowing is most intimate. Not knowing is as close as you can get to the bone. gets as close to the heart of things. It's closer to the heart of things than any other answer you could give. Yeah, it seems to be saying, right? So, what I wanted to do now in this part is to talk about, the Chinese roots of these kinds of stories and more how they were, followed through on in the tradition. So, for now, just for the sake of further exploration, let's say that this way, which we can't exactly prove, but let's hypothesize for the sake of exploration, that this way of talking, not knowing, is most intimate, is something that didn't come from India, but that the Dharma, as transmitted from India, became expressed by Chinese in this particular vocabulary because it worked for them. Why did it work for them? Where did it come from? What was there that made this like a good way to talk when it wasn't the way other people were talking? And as soon as you ask that question, it becomes, I don't always say no, yeah, but no, it seems very, very likely that it's Taoism. Yeah, it's just all over the place. And this is, so I picked out some excerpts from the Tao Te Ching, attributed to Lao Tzu, of course, traditionally, and this isn't intended to be a depiction of Taoism. It's a highly selective, highly politicized representation, in which I was looking for things that are, point to not knowing in different kinds of ways. But it's really striking. It's like that it's in directly or indirectly all through the text. The first one that jumped out at me is that knowing that you do not know is the best, and not knowing that you do not know is an illness. So that could mean a lot of things, just in it's like a lot of these parts of Tao Te Ching. We're not really sure, but on the surface, it seems to say that not knowing and understanding just how profoundly we don't know is best. If you don't know that you don't know, then that implies that you think you know, and that's a sickness. That's the problem. That's the problem with all the professors I know. We're professional knowers, and so we're in the sick category. And then there's Lao Tzu 47. The farther you go, the less you know. I remember reading this when I was an undergraduate and thinking, what the heck? He's against travel. A lot of ways to read it. But, of course, it probably means the farther you go along the path, the more you unburden yourself of, quote, knowledge, unquote, and the more knowledge you seek, the less you understand. Now, I would point out that second sentence. You notice here, we have two cognition verbs, or two cognition words. Knowledge, in this case, is the bad one, but understanding, in the second part of the line, is good, right? You want to understand, but without knowing. So there's a doubleness. And I think this goes back to Venerable Chodron's aphorism, that, there's different kinds of not knowing, and all the good ones involve some kind of knowing. It seems that fits with what the Tao Te Ching is saying. They're against knowing in a certain sense, because only by unknowing or not knowing can you really know, or something else. Fill in some other cognition or like word. You know what I'm saying? And it is like that, definitely, as you go through. The master leads by emptying people's minds, helping people lose everything that they know. Creates confusion in those who think that they know. That's in the third chapter of the Tao Te Ching. And the 14th chapter says, you can't know it, but you can be it at ease in your own life. And then, so that's the, knowing is bad. It's impossible. So thinking that you know, when it's actually impossible to know, is the problem. But then, what you should do instead is just realize where you come from, and this is the essence of wisdom. So now we have understanding, and 47 is good, realizing is good, wisdom is good in 14, but knowing is bad. Okay, so, that's fine. So, and then when the body's intelligence declines, So cleverness and knowledge step forth. This is the same thing. So a bodily embodied intelligence, the wisdom of the body is natural and good, and that when we become alienated from it by cleverness, rhetoric, logic seems pretty clearly in that category for Chinese Taoist tradition, then we're alienated from the natural wisdom of our bodies. The 20 says, stop thinking and end your problems. Oh, that's simple. Where's that hammer? I was going to hit myself. Yeah. So other people have a goal. I alone don't know. So this is being spoken from the point of view of the sage, although if I say sage, I'm implying somebody who has deep knowing, but maybe the unsage or whatever. I don't know. So yeah, the sage who knows that he doesn't know or she doesn't know is, the one who doesn't know. And then the master, residing in the Tao, sets an example for all beings. Because he has nothing to prove, he doesn't have any thesis. People can trust what he says. Because he doesn't know who he is, people recognize themselves in him. That's interesting. So he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't, and 24 makes that clear. You can't, if you try to define yourself, you never get to this self-understanding. So one of the points I want to make is look at 24. Knowing now is good. Knowing is now on the good side, and defining is on the bad side. So, the Tao Te Ching is not a technical text, right? Yeah. Yes? Maybe the 4th century BC. Maybe the 5th century BC. 5th century BC, maybe. 400s. I mean, this is a very messy topic. Some people think that there was a person named Lao Tzu who wrote it. And then other people think that it was compiled from different people, right? Yeah. Now, some people think there was a person named Lao Tzu was Lao Tan and that he lived roughly around the same time that the Buddha did. But then not everybody agrees. Yes? That's one thing. That's a good point. Yeah, it's that comes under the category, I would think, of what I was going to talk about in terms of parallels with other religions. But yeah, it's like to be blockish, to be blockish. Oh, she said, doesn't it remind you of the movie Being There, which is based on Jerry Kaczynski novel, and it's about somebody who is a very simple person. It's sort of a retelling of The Idiot by Dostoevsky. We have a person who's so simple that they don't get tangled up in any cultural deception. They're not smart enough to know how to engage in the stupidity of civilization, and so he's constantly inadvertently saying profound things. All right. Yeah. Yes. Oh yeah. What are the other pots? Oh, now I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Well, there's two things that are going on there. One is when you learn more things in school, then you have a clearer picture of how much you don't know and how you're not going to come to the end in this lifetime of all the knowables, right? But then there's a separate question as whether seeking, to know as many things as possible is helpful or unhelpful, or could be helpful in some cases and not in other cases, right? And that's what I think the latter would be, my kind of Buddhist point of view is like curiosity is good as long as we don't take it as the final value, and we're curious about why we're curious about particular things instead of other things, and we subject our curiosity to kind of a value test as well, not just thinking we should try to find out every possible fact. What's the average size of the beaks of ravens in Washington State, for example? That's in fact, so I don't know that it would be helpful to anybody to find out. So. So people, maybe you know this, people who haven't studied very much about Buddhism or Taoism, they tend to think, I've met a lot of people who think this, Buddhism has to do with going with the flow. And this is sort of, have you heard this? Like, people think that. And, we just sort of relax and let things follow their natural course. Like, Buddhism is about unstressing us. We're so stressed, and if we could just, go with the flow. But of course, on the superficial level, this is a confusion between Buddhism and Taoism, and the flow represents, the natural progression of the Tao. But I don't even really think it's the whole story in Taoism. But getting back to that, first, it seems clear that there's a lot of, Zen teachers that understand that the Dharma is something that isn't about going with the flow. And I had one of my personal favorite Zen books, which I can't use in classes, because Zen Master Raven, Robert Aitken's Roshi's last book. And I can't use it in class because it's very difficult. It's like a contemporary koan collection full of animal stories. All the students and all the teachers are all animals, but they say difficult koans it's like a retelling. I think it's a spiritual autobiography of Robert Aitken's life, but it's told through animals. And so on page 176, he says, Wolverine asks, "Do you practice going with the flow?" And Raven Roshi says, "Is that a practice?" And Wolverine asked, "Well, what is a practice then?" And Raven said, "Going against the grain." And Wolverine says, "That sounds hard." And Raven says, "Uphill." Raven always, has these one-word sentences quite a lot, being a Raven or a Zen master and both. Anyway, so people understand that. We shouldn't think that, I don't know. I don't want to be misunderstood as saying that Zen is a covert form of a popularized misunderstanding of Taoism. But it's really certain, I think inevitable, really, that many Chinese did and have, to a certain extent, understood the Dharma that they received through Taoist lenses, and probably now don't even realize it. Like in the beginning, people knew that they were doing that. But now it's just been integrated in, crossbreeding, or to a certain extent, so that it's just part of the DNA of the Dharma as practiced in East Asia. Includes, some modes of expression which derive from the Taoist tradition. So anyway, it occurred to me, thinking about all this knowing and understanding and realizing and so forth, that it seems pretty clear that knowing in the Tao Te Ching, has two contradictory senses, or maybe two different senses which might be contradictory. One, knowing, which is the bad one, means becoming invested in distinctions and categories and preferences, in making rules about right and wrong, in informing and adhering to interpretive categories with the aim of clarifying things, and in the end, just mucking everything up and alienating ourselves from our basic nature. Right? And then the other, which is the good kind of knowing, or sometimes called wisdom or understanding, but sometimes called knowing, and sometimes called really knowing, it means an undoing of all the former type of knowing, unthinking distinctions by recognizing the source of all things. Now, this is understood in Taoism as reversion. This is just a little Taoism. It's fan in Chinese, which means turning back. So the idea is there's a source of all things, which is the Tao, and it's not just a source at the beginning of time, it's the source right now. It's our basic nature, and so the ultimate nature of things, the ultimate source of all things, is rising from the way, the Tao. Right? So turning back is a process of sort of getting in touch with your basic nature, or your original face before your parents were born, if you do it in a Zen way, or who you fundamentally are. And the idea is that if you turn back, to your basic nature, instead of just adhering to superficially imposed cultural distinctions, then if you act spontaneously from within that, then it's not, driven by personal preference or desire, but it's like a spontaneity that's an expression of your basic nature. And so that's what people were trying to do. It wasn't just like, oh, do whatever you want to. I mean, Taoism wasn't confused with, hedonism. But people did believe that citified culture to some extent was violating their basic natures, and they wanted to turn back and reclaim those natures, and then act in a way that was based from that. It occurred to me this morning to think of that as analogous to the little Christian aphorism, love God and do as you will. So the idea is like, if you know God as your fundamental source and truly base yourself on love of God in Christian context, then you don't have to worry about the rules, because like insofar as you're acting from and within divine love, then there won't be a problem, right? It's like that idea. Yeah. So it seems clear anyway that Taoists meditated long before Buddhists came along. Reversion, or getting in touch with your basic source, or whatever, holding the one, sometimes they called it, was achieved through some type of meditation. Unfortunately, we don't have any like Taoist meditation guidebooks from before Buddhism came. It seemed like one of the things, and this is interesting, I noticed this one with the Tibetan and Indian stuff we're going to look at tomorrow, is that, people who are very much into this, like, unknowing and undoing, they tend not to create systematic philosophies or systematic instruction manuals. It's kind of right? It goes against the idea of the thing. So you don't have somebody who says, now here's the way you unknow. There's 6 key points. And the third one has 5 subpoints. You never see like those. And like, coming from, where I come from, I'm like, all right, how do we do this? What's the procedure? What's the algorithm for, getting in touch with the basic nature of things in Taoism? And like, well, it's very difficult. They have all these just little, maybe you just need to be there and have a teacher who shows you how to do it. But later on, they did create, meditation manuals, because I think they're competing with the Buddhists, and that seemed like something that was useful. So, anyway, as I've said, I think it's just, personally, this is just me, I think it's irresistible, the idea that the Halifax Glassman tenet of not knowing is genetically connected to ancient Taoism. Which I'm not going to say that makes it un-Buddhist. It's genetically connected in the sense that, at least in the sense that the mode of expression derives ultimately from Tao, the most ancient kinds of Taoism, rather than directly from India. So I have a couple friends who practice Soto. I don't actually have experience practice with Zen. But I have a couple friends who've done a lot of Soto meditation. One is a Soto priest and has been for decades, very serious. So I just asked them about not knowing. I'd like to know more about not knowing. What do you think the deal is with that, and so forth, this kind of question. And they had different answers. Well, from my point of view. Maybe from their point of view, they're not different. I don't know. Anyway, one said that not knowing is important because it allows you to be dynamically responsive and flexible. So the idea seems to be there that you have this openness, not being locked in like to set a grid, conceptual grid, a schema, then you can be more creative, more open in your response to other people. The idea is, of course, he's speaking as a Buddhist, you can be more skillful and more compassionately helpful to people if you don't have the set of rules and guidelines about how to do that locks you in a priori. And not unknowing those rules is a way to to discover the possibility of saying something that you didn't know you knew, but would be just the right thing to say to a certain person at a certain time, right? Spontaneously, you find coming out of your mouth the thing that somebody else most needs to hear. But you didn't even know you knew it yourself, right? but it comes out of this, other kind of place of openness to the situation rather than following a program. So that's the way Dale, friend, who's a Soto priest, answered the question. My other Soto friend said, he understands not knowing in terms of non-discrimination, like not picking and choosing, like sort of like what Venerable Chögyam was talking about in terms of the Dalai Lama, not like, oh, I love sunny weather, but I hate cloudy weather. Oh, I love warm weather, I hate cold weather. I love vanilla, I hate chocolate. And it's like, which one, so we get to pick which things in cyclical existence we like and which ones we don't, and then we're just caught up in attachment and aversion based on our, personal preferences. And that, David's understanding is that not knowing means letting go of that, what they call in Zen, picking and choosing. That's why they talk about that, as picking and choosing. All right. So, Dale, my Soto Zen priest friend, also told me, when we were talking about not knowing, that he got interested indirectly in Zen practice in the first place because of reading Zhuangzi, the second most famous Taoist text, and which I pulled a few random excerpts out of as reading 9 here. Zhuangzi is pretty much one of my favorite books because I think it has a lot of wisdom in it that's very, very close to Buddhist teaching, but has a lot of humor in it, which maybe is a little thin on the ground in some of your Buddhist shastras. So I just pulled out a couple of things that seem to relate to not knowing. One is the famous butterfly story, where Zhuangzi wakes up and he's not sure whether, he's been dreaming he's a butterfly, he wakes up, he doesn't know whether he's now, a butterfly dreaming that he's a human or a human dreaming he's a butterfly. The key point for our perspective is the phrase in the beginning of the third line, he didn't know. It was like the point of the story is not to resolve this, but to point out the unknowability of things. And then one of my favorite and the strangest comments from the Tao Te Ching is the torch of chaos and doubt. This is what the sage steers by. It's like chaos and doubt, it's like, that seems like absolute, it's intended to, it sounds like a Zen thing, right? You can say, oh, this is where the Zen people are getting this way of talking backwards of what people think they should be saying. Doubt and chaos are, intellectual murk, the destruction of everything that we take as order is the basis for the place within which we find real wisdom. I'm trying to connect that to what Halifax's idea of the fruitful darkness. And when you get out of where does the order is coming from our minds, and you have to let go of that in order to find something more fundamental. So he calls that clarity. So this is strange, Real clarity is something that involves letting go of what we think of as order. And then another passage, Zhuangzi talks about everything that appears in the world, in our minds: joy, anger, grief, delight, worry, regret, fickleness, inflexibility, modesty, willfulness, candor, insolence. All these different things come up, arise in our experience, and one after another. Like mushrooms popping up. And instead of saying, well, let's analyze what are the causing conditions under which people tend to be inflexible or fickle, instead he says, and no one knows where they sprout from. What does it mean? Fundamentally, ultimately, their ultimate source is unknowable. That's how I read that. Right? Their ultimate source being unknowable or inexpressible is like the Buddha holding up a flower and saying, well, there's nothing really I can say about this, It's inexpressible, just as it is inexpressible. Then, in terms of, Zhuangzi talking about meditation, there's several different passages. And there's just one of the great humorous things in Zhuangzi is that sometimes he has Confucius as a character who's a complete idiot. And then he turns around like one page later and he has Confucius as the Taoist sage. right? Teaching exactly the opposite of what the historical Confucius would have said. So I guess that's the torch of chaos and doubt. I don't know. Anyway, Yun Wei, who's historical figure, was Confucius' favorite disciple, said, "May I ask what the fasting of the mind is?" Of course, that's a Taoist term, and Confucius and Yun Wei never discussed it. Confucius, the Taoist teacher, says, "Make your will one. Don't listen with your ears, listen with your mind." No, don't listen with your mind. Listen with your spirit. Listening stops with the ears. Mind stops with recognition. But something else, we're going to call the spirit, is empty, and it waits on things. And the way, the Tao, gathers in this emptiness alone. So finding this kind of emptiness where you've negated all of the other sensory and mental input is where you find your fundamental nature. It's not going to be in a space of like seeing something more accurately. It's an unseeing creates the negation of your ordinary sensory input, creates a space for the way. And then the same two have a dialogue, and Yun Wei reports, "I'm improving." And Confucius says, "What do you mean by that?" And Yun Wei says, "I can sit down and forget everything." And Confucius is startled, means he's very impressed. "What do you mean you can sit down and forget everything?" Yun Wei says, "I smash up my limbs and body, drive out perception and intellect, cast out form, do away with understanding," very important, "and make myself identical with the way. That's what I mean by sitting down and forgetting everything." So, I don't know. It says what it says. We have to decide whether this is advocating a position that Tsongkhapa is directly refuting, which is that something like this, that the ultimate nature of things is inexpressible. And therefore, what you need to set your mind on is nothing in particular. Because if you were to set your mind on any particular view, it would not be the actual nature of things. The actual nature of things can't be formulated or conceptualized in any way. So it's only when you understand the untenability of any possible formulation, and you let go of your attempts to grasp onto any formulation, and then you set your mind on that, in that space where there's nothing to hold or nothing to grasp or no idea, then your mind is in accord. This is, I'm quoting a wrong position from Lamrim Chenmo. Your mind is in accord with the nature of reality, because nature of reality is inexpressible, and now there's nothing that can be said about the contents of your mind either, right? It's been stabilized in this completely emptied out condition. Tsongkhapa says this is terrible and proceeds to explain why he thinks it's terrible. But it seems to me very close, I have to say, to some of this Taoist meditation thing. One other thing which I didn't put here from Zhuangzi. There's a madman who appears in the text who, of course, represents the actual sage. And Confucius, as the stupid moralist, is trying to give him instructions. And the madman says, "It's dangerous to mark out a path and run." This is what I always look for. What are the spiritual instructions for step 1 and step 2? No, don't, that's not the way. That's not the way. The way is not a recipe with certain steps. Okay, so the madman says, "Instead, I walk a crooked way. Don't step on my feet." A crooked way is like, of course, referring to the idea of how water comes down the side of a mountain. It comes down the natural way, which is not like a canal that the humans put there. It comes just, the natural way that water flows, which is going to be crooked. And so he's essentially saying that, like if you practice a natural way that's in tune with your fundamental nature, it will, like water flowing down a mountain, not be straight as an arrow. It will have its bends and winds and so forth. So when you're in touch with your deepest nature and you act spontaneously from within that, you don't want someone stepping on your feet by giving you rules about right and wrong, or become fixated on these, giving you a marked path about what you're supposed to do next. Because when you follow rules like that, you're violating the inclinations of your own fundamental nature. That's what the madman seems to be saying to Confucius. Now, one of the things that Well, let me just say one little Zen thing related to that, and then I'll say what could be a problem with this. So you probably already know this, Still Carrying That Woman story. That was a really famous Zen story about two monks who, were ordained, and it was against their vinaya to touch women. And they're walking along in a rainstorm, and the road's been flooded out, and there's like a terrible flash flood. And they find, standing there, unable to cross, a woman with a long gown, and she would be washed away instantly if she went into the water. But so one of the monks picks her up, and the two of them wade through. They get to the other side, they put her down, and then the woman goes one way, and then the two monks go the other way. And then after about a mile, the one monk says to the other, "So what did you think you were doing back there?" And the first monk says, "Well, what do you mean?" And the first one says, "Well, you touched that woman." And then the other monk says, "Well, are you still carrying her? I put her down back there." Right? So this is, I think, a Zen expression of what the difference is between rule following and spontaneous compassionate action. And I would draw a line, from the madman of Zhuangzi. You can draw other lines from India that come to here as well. But there is also a line that comes from this idea that the right way to act doesn't come out of, narrow adherence to the rules, but understanding this in the deepest way. I don't mean just the spirit of the legal code. I mean the deepest spirit, the deepest inner nature of us from which that arises. That's how they're thinking. Buddha nature is fundamentally an expression of compassion. And at a certain place in time, it seems like that these rules are necessary. But then it could be misunderstood in a way that causes this woman to drown. You see what I'm saying? So that would be not helpful. All right. So, all right. We're following the rules. I don't know. I meet people like this, right? In the hospital is a good example. I was telling you later, these nurses are very compassionate and kind people, and it hurts them when they then following the rules means not helping people in the way that they feel that those people really need to be helped. And I've seen other instances of that. You probably have too in my life. Okay, now, I'll take a sip of water. We know probably that there was a split in the history of Chan between the people in the north and the people in the south, which is very much parallel in some ways to the later contest in Tibet that we talk about as the Lhasa debate between people who believe in so-called sudden enlightenment and people believe in so-called gradual enlightenment. I talked about this here before when we were doing different kinds of Madhyamaka in Tibet. But I have something new to say about it, which is really helpful. Always when I teach this to my students about, the sudden people are in the south, and and then gradual people are in the north, they always get confused because they think sudden enlightenment has to do with pow, one day like Newton's apple, hit him on the tree and he had a big epiphany. Sudden enlightenment sounds so much like it means epiphany-oriented Zen that people just can never get past that to what it's actually talking about. All right. So there's a new words which don't come from the tradition but are actually better, and that is to talk about the difference between innate and constructivist. So constructionists are like Theravada or Gelugpa, who think, look, we're not enlightened. But there are certain causes and conditions that, like building materials, that we could gather that would allow us to put together the make an enlightenment building, so to speak. All right. It's not something we have, but it's something we can get if we assemble the proper causes and conditions. And then at the other extreme, you have people who say, oh, we're Buddhas already. That's the main point, is that we're Buddhas from the very beginning, right? I read, last time or the time before I came, a Kagyu teacher who's, asks his master in India, what should I tell those people over in the West? And the master said, well, tell them they're all Buddhas. That's what they need to know, is that they're all fundamentally perfect from the very beginning. That's the main point. Then the question, of course, becomes, well, how come we didn't know that? How come we're not omniscient? How come we have all these fights with people in our family? And so that becomes the thing that they have to work with and talk about. But the basic idea is that it's a process of uncovering who we already are, rather than getting some new wisdom. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like, instead of getting knowledge, we have to undo something that's keeping us from being who we already fundamentally are, Buddha. So if you think about these as very extreme positions, hey, we're already Buddhas, just stated baldly. And the other is that, Buddha nature means that we have the potential to become a Buddha, but we're definitely not Buddhas. Or so you could put those like at the extremes, and then you could point out that not everybody's at the extremes. There's lots of different teachers who, are somewhere in between in terms of what they think Buddha nature is. Does Buddha nature mean that you have all of the major and minor characteristics of a Buddha here within your personal continuum? And so forth. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like, when you say we're Buddhas, what exactly are we talking about here? And some people will go a lot farther than others in terms of saying what's already here right now. Okay. So if you think about that continuum, I'm just saying this is something that's been super helpful to me, so I don't want to fail to pass that on. So if you think about the North and the South in Chan, they're disagreeing about this. And it's called sudden and gradual, but basically the sudden people are the innatists who think, basically meditation is a way of expressing our Buddha nature. It's not a way of attaining Buddhahood. And the people, I'm oversimplifying, but that's the basic idea. The people in the North think that meditation, we have a fundamental mirror-like mind, but we have to gradually purify it by cleaning the mirror of the mind, and it's not like that we're already fundamentally Buddhas. So this was a real problem. Apparently, it got to be difficult in the tradition. It was perceived as a problem, not just made up later, and it came to be resolved. And there's different ways of telling the story about how it came to be resolved, but my interest here is focusing on traditional story, which is that there was a text that worked this out called the Sando Kai, which meant the harmony, means in Japanese, that's a Japanese title, that's originally a Chinese text, called the harmony of difference and equality. And it's frequently chanted in Zen temples down to today. It's a very short text. And, I put some excerpts here as number 11. So right before that, the guy who wrote this Sando Kai, which seemed to resolve, at least on the philosophical level, this problem, was named Sekito. That's the Japanese version of his name. And one day, this is number 10 on your handout, one day Sekito saw his advanced student Yaku-san sitting in meditation and said, "What are you doing?" And Yaku-san said, "Nothing at all." And Sekito said, "Then you're sitting idly." And Yaku-san said, "If I were, I would be doing something." Ooh, that's an advanced student, right? And then the teacher, so here's your graduate school. "You say you're not doing anything, but what is this not doing?" And Yaku-san is ready. No one knows. No one knows what this not doing is. That sounds like it. So he gets his diploma. I thought that was a great not knowing story about the author of this text. The actual text, I didn't put it all here, even though it is kind of short. I just pulled out some representative pieces. The mind of the great sage of India, that's Buddha, was intimately conveyed from west to east. Among human beings, there are wise ones and fools, but in a way, there is no northern or southern ancestor. Right? So ultimately, in the way, there's no north or south. It means there's no sudden and gradual differentiation. The subtle source is clear and bright. The branching streams flow through darkness. What does that mean? Well, this turns out to be the crucial thing. The subtle, when you talk about the clear and bright, you're talking about conventional distinctions that are obvious in the light. And therefore, you're talking about a gradual approach in which we're not Buddhas, but we could possibly become by accumulating certain causes and conditions. So that's what I would take to be light. And obviously, darkness is the opposite. It's the ultimate level where you can't say that there's attainment or non-attainment. That's sort of the Heart Sutra from this morning, right? Yeah. So there's neither attainment nor non-attainment, and there's neither north nor south. There's neither sudden nor gradual in the darkness. But then there isn't any other place for things to be in some sense except for darkness, because everything is empty. So the light is flowing in the darkness, and the darkness is in the light. To say that the conventional ultimate are two sides of the same coin is already to separate them too much. That's the point. They're fully interpenetrating. And so basically what this guy does is say, look, this distinction between gradually becoming enlightened and suddenly becoming enlightened is something that only operates at the conventional level. And at the conventional level, it's appropriate to talk about that, but you have to realize that ultimately all of these distinctions are, don't hold up. My way of translating that into Tsongkhapa speak would be to say that the conventional and ultimate are conventionally different, but not ultimately different. Right? And this is our way of talking, and I'm really glad to have it. But it's not too hard to see that there could be a different way of pointing at that, and that this Sandokai seems to be saying that, essentially, but in a more poetic, indirect sort of way. So, Katagiri Roshi, now I sort of like did our tracing a little bit. I want to look at some other Zen things that are more close to contemporary. Half an hour. Katagiri Roshi, was in Rochester, and he has famous book is called "You Have to Say Something." So I think this relates to this. Is like basically the implication is it's somehow going to be a problem to say anything. Now, if you're a Gelugpa, it never seems to be a problem, but apparently, it's already a problem. It's just a given that it's a problem to say anything. Look, Buddha had a hard time figuring out what to say. He just did show without the tell. So, like, what are we supposed to do? So things just as they are, suchness, we say, it's inexpressible. And so as soon as you say something, anything, you're already wrong. You've defiled the immaculate Dharma in some sense. Okay, so we can't just all hold up flowers or sticks and look at that. So there's a problem. That's why what are we going to do? We have to, these Zen centers, they have to give Zen, Teisho, Zen talks, which include words. So, this is a koan, right? Then is about that. It's from the number 12 in your handout is the famous koan from Muon Kan, or the Gateless Barrier. The priest Shang Yen said, it is it. I love this. It. What is it? It. Our situation, the Dharma, something. It is as though, I didn't take something out, that's the way it begins. It is as though you were up in a tree, hanging from a branch with your teeth. Your hands and feet can't touch any branch. Someone appears beneath the tree and asks, what is the meaning of Bodhidharma's coming from the west? If you don't answer, you evade your responsibility. But if you do answer, you lose your life. What do you do? And then Wu Men helpfully points out that, okay, I could say, well, I'm happy to lose my life. I'll recite the Four Noble Truths as I'm dying, in order to help this person. No, that's why he's saying you can't get out of it that way, because even if your eloquence flows like a river, it will all be in vain. Because you can't think that you will be able to explain it better than Buddha. And so, which is basically inexpressible. And I was like reflecting on this a little bit, and I was thinking how, well, in some sense, many people, just like in non-religious contexts, have said, well, in thinking about the problem of teaching, that you can't really tell anybody anything, really. I mean, we go through the motions of telling people things for the purpose of, encouraging learning. But it's not actually like I am pouring knowledge into you, as you know. It's nothing like that, really. Everything you say is not quite right and is misunderstood, in any case, through the filters, as somebody was saying, of the particular hearers. And I always feel this in class. Like at the beginning of the semester, as soon as I start talking about Buddhism, I will be creating misunderstandings. The only hope is that these misunderstandings will be slightly less bad than they were before. You know, that's like being realistic about the situation. Yeah. I had a terrible example of this. I had a Bible colleague who really wanted to make it clear, because of the history of anti-Semitism in Christianity, that the Jews did not crucify Jesus. So he would always teach his class, the Jews did not crucify Jesus. That's a Roman method of execution. The Romans killed Jesus. And so when this student was getting ready to graduate, she came to talk to me, and she said, Bill Reeder told me that the Catholics killed Jesus. I was like, what? I know he didn't tell you that. And I said, what did he actually say? He said, well, the Romans did it. I was like, no. Oh, God. I couldn't make that up. Not that clever. Yeah. So, I don't know, maybe that's a little, how dangerous not knowing can be from my point of view. So, yeah, everything that we say, even when he's really determined to clear up an understanding that's been really a problem. And in the process, he's like accidentally created an anti-Catholic bias in place of an anti-Jewish bias. All right. Okay. So, I don't know. Soko Morinaga, in terms of this thing, is like that there's only so much a teacher can do for you because of this situation, you know. You can't like tell it to you exactly as it is so that it appears in your mind just as it is in her mind. So Soko Morinaga, the Zen teacher, I was holding up his book this morning. Oh, I don't know where I went now. Oh, under here. Yeah, Novice to Master. He starts his book with this really strange story. He's giving a talk at a university, and people go on break, and when they come back from break, he says, oh, did you guys have enough time to urinate? And everybody's kind of nervous, and then he says, well, like, pissing is something that no one else can do for you. Only you can piss for yourself. And everybody's laughing, you know, and then he says, no, you have to realize this is perfectly serious. No one else can live your life for you, you know. Nobody else can piss for you. Nobody else can awaken for you. People just, you know, do the best they can to help one another. But then, you know, you can't actually make things appear in the other person's mind. Soko Morinaga, in the same book, he has another passage that I think relates to this idea of not knowing. Has a student who's a serious Zen practitioner, and he comes and asks the teacher about the idea that he's read about called an unmoving mind or a still heart. And the student doesn't know what this means, wants to attain it, thinks probably that it's some type of concentration or equanimity. And Morinaga says, no, the mind in its natural state, the natural state of the mind, has the power to receive everything perfectly just as it is and not get caught. We call this Zen. It neither ignores anything nor attaches itself to anything. And it's not attained through training, which is so ironic because he's just spent like most of the book describing how intense and rigorous his training was and how he wouldn't have been able to explain this to us unless he'd been through that. But the point is that he doesn't see that training as an attaining of something. It's an uncovering of something that is his basic nature from the beginning. Right? We're born with it, he says. We are born with that. That makes the innate, you know, I'm saying this. Think of this as the innate approach, not the sudden approach. We're already born with it. Monastic training is for the purpose of bringing this innate capacity to life and to allow us to freely demonstrate that which is our birthright. Right? And I always show this film in my Buddhism class called Land of the Disappearing Buddha. Probably everybody's shown it who teaches Buddhism for a long time. And it has this great Zen master in it, Yamada Mumon Roshi, who apparently is most famous for having said that Zen in Japan is dead and needs to be reimported from the United States. And so he's asked about Zen on film, and he says, and instead of saying some Zen thing, he says, unless the heart becomes that of a little child, man cannot enter the kingdom of heaven, quoting Jesus. And then he says, Zen is becoming a little child. The baby has no knowledge and no experience. Yeah, exactly. This is what the Tao Te Ching says, right? The sage, the wise person, the person who really knows in Taoism is understood not just as a blockhead, right, as an uncarved block, but also as a baby. Those are all unlimited, unspoiled potential, hasn't been differentiated into anything, right? So like, talk about beginner's mind, right? That's the idea. And so he makes it very explicit. Zen is, that's what he thinks. And so, anyway, I mean, he got this idea of quoting Jesus because he'd been involved in Buddhist-Christian dialogue a lot. But I think that resonated with him and he pulled it out because he has that, heritage of thinking in terms of the Tao Te Ching. Tao Te Ching 20, I alone am still like a newborn baby yet to smile, like a person with no home. So, it's hard to know, and if we did know, then maybe we'd be missing the point, but maybe I'm just like being nitpicky. But it appears that there's a Zen concept, very closely connected to non-knowing, not knowing, that's called Mushin. Mushin is Japanese for no mind, and sometimes they say Mushin no Shin, which means the mind of no mind, or the no mind mind. And this phrase has quite a lot of currency these days, Mushin. And descriptions of Mushin seem to be similar in many ways to what Glassman and Halifax are calling not knowing. Which is really interesting because the main context in which you see Mushin talked about these days is martial arts. And martial arts is an application of not knowing. Do you see what I'm saying? Like I was saying before, that Halifax is interested in applying, and actually Glassman too, they're all like taking it to the streets in some sense, not figuring out how they can apply their not knowing in a practical context. Whatever that we understand. Applied darkness was my phrase from before. I don't know. So on number 13 in the handout, I have a description of Mushin. I don't know if you have to read it all. But anyway, Mushin is sometimes understood as being the essence of Zen, the essence of Buddhism, the essence of Japanese martial arts. Sometimes called a state of no-mindedness. And what does that mean? A state where the mind is not fixed on or occupied by any thought or emotion, and is nonetheless connected to everything. Oh, that reminds me of the discussion this morning about snorkeling. So it's not a conscious thought. It's a pure mental clarity produced by the absence of a limited self. It's similar to the concept, or identical to the concept of mind like water, a mind that resembles a still pond without any ripples. So it's like a basic mirror-like wisdom, and that way it seems similar to what Soko Morinaga was talking about, the mind that doesn't move, the perfectly still mind. So I don't know, it's the same kind of thing where you're like, lots of different things that I would think of as different are all sort of put together. Now there's a Japanese guy from the 17th century, Rinzai lineage in Japan, named Takuan, very famous, Takuan. And he was by far the most influential person in connecting Zen in Japan to the martial arts. And one of the problems that came up about this, and this is something I was alluding to, is possibly a problem before, is that it doesn't seem that there's any ethics involved in this. So, you can be a lot better killer, or hospice worker, or, what have you. If you can sort of clear your mind in some ways, that's the idea. And Takuan doesn't put into his Zen some idea about the precepts or nonviolence, or place not knowing, or Mushin, in some kind of context where there's some boundaries. And in fact, it's explicitly linked to sword, cutting people with swords. More effectively. Yeah, not just in general, but optimally, the optimal attack, right? Your attack will not be slowed down by any thinking, like that. So Robert Aiken, who's, one of my guys, right? Robert Aiken Roshi. He has a famous book called Mind of Clover that I didn't bring. But it's vivid in my mind that he like openly attacks Taquan, or you could say, criticizes him, faults him for this failure to transmit ethical precepts. And he went so far, and this is like really intense for one Zen master to say about another. He said, sometimes even the devil quotes scripture. Right? Yeah. So, yeah, his point is that, like, just because there's this tradition in Zen, about which goes back to not knowing, it doesn't mean it has to be embedded within a context of practice and discipline that includes ethical training. Certainly that's the case with Soko Morinaga when he talks about the mind that is still. He's not talking about using it to kill people more effectively. He's talking about that in the context of a bigger context where he's doing all kinds of ethical practices as well. Yeah, and we'll talk more about this as we come over into the Indo-Tibetan stuff tomorrow, but there's a famous article by Geshe Sangye Sandrup, a.k.a. George Dreyfus, which is in the Journal of Buddhist Ethics, which is an online, completely free journal, and it's called Meditation as an Ethical Activity. And George there, specifically says that meditation is not about like dropping all ethics. It's fundamentally part of a tradition of improving our moral character, and that it's a misunderstanding to take it out of that context. But he makes a very good argument. He's a very excellent scholar in Western way, as well as being a geisha, right? Getting towards the end, you might not quite make it. I read, and this is not something I know directly from personal experience, that the largest school of Zen in the West is the Kwan school that derives from Sung San's adaptation of Korean and other practices for Buddhism in the West. So, that may be true. And Sung San, as you remember, was one of Roshi Halifax's teachers. And a particular famous letter, which you can easily find online, that Sung San wrote to someone named Patricia. He says this: if you are thinking, you will not understand Zen. Anything that can be written, anything that can be said, this is all thinking. If you're thinking, every book is demon's words. But if you read with a mind that has cut off all thinking, then every book is the truth. But so is the barking of the dog and the crowing of a rooster, or maybe a turkey in our case. So all things are teaching you at every moment. Zen means keeping the mind which is prior to thinking. Science, academic studies, these are things that come after thinking. But we have to awaken, we have to return to what is before thinking, and this is our true self. Zen is to cut off all thinking and keep the not moving mind. So I ask you, what are you? That's just interesting. So what are you means there's some process of inquiry, seeking understanding. And because this next sentence is, you don't know. But then he says, there's only this I don't know. It's not that you should start out with I don't know and then you should find out. No, you should always keep this don't know mind. Throw away opinions, likes and dislikes. Your before thinking mind and my before thinking mind and all people's before thinking minds are the same. So this is like how we understand our oneness with turkeys and mountains and rivers and stuff, because, we all have this preconceptual, I don't know what to say. There it is. So when someone expressed that, I was like, I'm not on the inside of this. So when people would talk, of course, around Sung San, you would ask them questions and they would have to say something, right? So when someone expressed the Dharma quite well with words, Sung San's habit was to praise them, but then question how so many words could reach the point. And then he would say frequently, go to the kitchen and drink a glass of cold water. And apparently he said this quite a bit. This was his stock thing, like Zen teachers get a certain, rhythm going, right? And that was his. Go to the kitchen and drink a glass of cold water. So, I just have to say honestly that this way of teaching the Dharma or speaking strains me And it probably wouldn't help me. I think the first time he said, go to the kitchen and drink cold water, I would go to find a different teacher. But that's maybe that not to say that he wouldn't be a good teacher for some other people, but that wouldn't work for me because I would immediately start thinking a lot more immediately as soon as he said, like, I would think, well, why does the water have to be cold? Won't our before-thinking mind discriminate cold rather than hot or lukewarm? So even without a thought, we'll already be making a distinction. Clean water, cold water, kitchen as opposed to temple room. And it's just the beginning of more and more differences. And from my point of view, that's a good thing. Because otherwise everything just melted down into one and we wouldn't be able to talk about, chopping people with swords versus not doing so. Because they're all part of our before-thinking mind. So, anyway, I'm not saying that this, that Taquan is the only person who gets called out for being completely outside of ethical precepts. But these other people, I'm not saying that. It's clear that they're teaching these things within the context of ethical training as well. And this, as I mentioned, Sung San was one of Halifax's teachers. And we have to understand that I think we've alluded to that one teacher's not knowing or still mind or mushen is not necessarily the same as the other, although we'll be the ones who are making the distinctions. I was talking to Venerable Chudron about the late Chan Master Sheng Yen, who is the author of his autobiography, Footprints in the Snow, really great Dharma story, and founder of Dharma Drum in Taiwan. And he quotes in his book various early Zen masters as saying, Sung San, who's the third patriarch, when you drop distinctions between good and evil, and when you let go in practice of any thought or of any goal or something to attain, then you will find the way. Right? But you have to, so that sounds like it's the same thing. But basically, what he said, he puts in there, in practice. So what he means is, when you're in the midst of meditation, you're going into this condition where you're realizing something that transcends duality, right? But then, he makes it clear from other things that he's saying that he's not trying to say, oh, we should drop all these dualistic distinctions when we're deciding whether to chop somebody with a sword or not. In fact, he tells his students when they're on retreat, that they should not misunderstand him as meaning that Zen is stopping thought, because if it were just that, he could hit them on the head with a hammer. That's where I get my head with the hammer, hitting head with the hammer thing. It's like, is that a path? No, it's not a path. And I haven't heard somebody come right out and admit that that's what their teaching is. So Sheng Yen is explicit about that. There's something apparently that people are understanding, albeit in a non-dualistic way, apparently. Also, in his autobiography, he talks about spending 3 years on retreat in which he read the entire Buddhist canon, which that's very impressive non-knowing. Or maybe that's not exactly the whole story. You know what I'm saying? Suzuki Roshi has this great commentary, which people don't know. Everybody just knows Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. But there's also Branching Streams Flow in the Darkness, which is his commentary on the Sando Kai. And he says, all the diverse things, form and so forth, that appear to our minds are these branching streams. But they're never apart from emptiness or darkness or not knowing. And likewise, the darkness is not apart from the flowing stream. So a student asks him, well, does that mean that we can practice the Buddha's way without knowing the Buddha's way intellectually? And he says, unfortunately, not. Which is so interesting, right? It's like there's the not and there's the unfortunately. We would really like to go totally gonzo, non-conceptual, but it turns out that doesn't quite work. And he says, it's easier to chant without worrying about the meaning of what we're chanting, but that is not the path. We have to go back and forth between study and practice. That seems like a good place to start because I'm redeeming, That's Shunryu Suzuki Roshi in this book. In fact, I think I have the page number for that quote. That's on page 94. Branching streams flow in the darkness. Shinryu Suzuki Zen Talks on the Sandokai. Okay. I feel like I rushed a little bit, but we still have 5 minutes, so I could take a question. Yes. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, I'm pouring information, information about not knowing and so forth, and so that produces that kind of effect when we start to learn things of realizing that, oh, there's a whole world of stuff out there that I don't know about. Yeah.
Thinking about the karma and will, religion, and the things and desire. Today, in the speaking, I'm looking at these different languages, looking at the languages and kind of knowing. But to know in that way creates more religion and will and karma. So I'm thinking of not knowing because when looking at a way of working with that religion and will and faith. Not
Okay, well, if you try to link this to the dependent arising cycle that you're talking about, I mean, my thinking, and this goes to the point about not picking and choosing, it comes from the third patriarch of Chan, Sengzan. He has this famous verse, where he says, the perfect way is without difficulty. Just give up picking and choosing. So the idea is that picking and choosing means like these are the things I want to attach to, and these are the things I want to be as I want to repulse. we need a really good opposite of attachment in a bad way word. But these are things I have strong aversion for, and I want to keep as far away from me as possible. And these are things I want to assimilate into myself and identify with and cling on to. And I think there's one, what I've tried to say is that, like, not knowing is a grab bag of things, which in Chan Zen seems to be meaningful to lump together. But from my way of thinking, it seems useful to distinguish different pieces of the grab bag. And one piece of the grab bag is this, of saying, well, we can know the difference between hot and cold, but still have a balanced mind, and not become attached to, like it was sunny when we started and now it's gotten more cloudy and windy, So, if we were grasping onto the sunny part, then that's been frustrated, and then maybe we're slightly, what I'm saying, we have some sort of problem that comes out of the desirous grasping for some kinds of things and aversion for others. That's how I would try to connect those two things. Yeah.
A lot of it is just right here. It's just, I don't have enough depth to understand it, but it's also something important you just said, is that for the Zen tradition that comes out of China and Japan, it's seamless to put the Taoist notion of not knowing it into what comes in India.
Yeah.
It's a cultural lesson necessary too.
I was saying that, yeah. I think it's seamless in the sense that, like, this had been around for so long by the time, Chan got started, in China, Taoism had probably been in China for 800 years. So this wasn't like first was Taoism, then Buddhism came. And Buddhism and Taoism might have started around the same time, but they started way far apart. And Buddhism came to China. There wasn't any initial, Bodhidharma didn't come with the first wave or the second wave, right? He came quite a bit later. That's why he was talking to a Buddhist emperor when he showed up. People forget that. Buddhism was well established in China by the time Bodhidharma came and had this conversation with the emperor. The emperor was basically, he was a Buddhism fan. And he'd given like a patron too. He'd given like huge amounts of money, and he wanted to be told, "You've accumulated merit that's faster than the number of sands in the Ganges River," etc. In fact, that's what he was counting on hearing, right?
There's something fundamentally Taoist thought that fundamentally contradicts what Tim says the Indian Buddhist thought, which makes this discussion so important because, to my mind, it would be possible to think about all of this as being recursive, right? That is, as long as you stay away from the dualistic notion that it's either or, you can put knowing and unknowing sort of in a big circle, right?
Yeah.
It just goes in that way. But I think the discussion is saying that's not enough to really understand it. Because that packages it too neatly to just say, well, you have to take a dialectical approach to knowing and not knowing. If you hold them both simultaneously because they fit together.
Oh, I see what you're getting at. Yeah.
But in Taoist thought, there's something that is just different, and it makes that lineage.
I think what I would say to that is like, okay, so if you have this dialectic between knowing and not knowing, and they can mean different things, and then they come together in different ways in different traditions. I think one of the things that leaves out for me is this distinction between, which seems really important in the tradition, between the people who think that we're fundamentally Buddhists from the very beginning and the people who think that we're definitely not, but we want to be. And the other people said, well, you shouldn't want to be something you already are. And then, and it creates like so much misunderstanding. And it leads to different kinds of practices and different ways of talking as to whether you think we're uncovering something that's already like Chenrezig Hall was like actually already there, but then it was uncovered, versus like the idea that it was put together one brick at a time or something like that. And those are like, that spectrum, I think, describes, it helps us get at the kind of differences that are going on here to some extent within Buddhism. Yeah. Well, okay, so if you think we're already Buddhists from the very beginning, then it is like the Taoist idea that what we have to do is turn back to our fundamental nature and then act spontaneously from within that. So then you can get crazy wisdom traditions, in Tantra, where you say, and the point isn't to follow rules, the point is to like attain a kind of non-dualistic understanding where spontaneously you can be helpful in a way that transcends any ethical norms. And then the other people over in the monastery say, what the hell are you doing? And that's like making Buddhism look bad. And they say, well, you're the one who's making Buddhism look bad because you're turning it into a library. And then, it's like, and then this is the same thing in Tibet. You have the people in the caves and meditating, and then you have the people in the monasteries, and then they go back and forth. It's not a clean thing, right? Tsongkhapa meditates in caves too. But, right, there's lots of yogi scholars. But there becomes to be a big distinction between the ones who focus on trying to understand things and build up the causes and conditions because they think understanding is an important part of that. Like if you think understanding and knowing more is going to help you become a Buddha, then you might want to go to school, learn some stuff, right? And that's what people did in Tibet. They had these big monastic institutions, and they had a lot of education that was really important. They had a lot of books, and they valued the books a great deal. And then some other people would, have 1 or 0 books, and their Lama would whisper something in their ear. And they were really proud to not have books because they thought that would be harming them. Yeah. Yes?
So, what I keep thinking of, a couple of things, but one of them that strikes me the most is, especially in Confucian China, there's very prescriptive life, and if you look at what Confucius did, he said, there are certain rules about how if you are the second son, you do it. If you're the first son, you do things. If you're the second daughter, you do it. If you're the third daughter, you do it. So it's very prescriptive. When you have a very prescriptive structured environment, in which there are procedures and everything is procedural.
Mhm.
And then we're trying to introduce the idea of judgment and knowledge and expertise into society that's primarily procedural. Then it sounds like not knowing. It sounds like you give up your procedures in order to be able to, in order to do things from analysis. So,
Okay.
yeah, so and this comes, this comes out of, for me, it comes out of, when somebody wants a computer program, I say, what are your procedures? You can automate those and put them in the computer and then have a program. The things that are not procedural, the things that require your judgment and decisions, your understanding, your knowledge, and decisions, can be automated in the program.
I see. That's what, okay. Well, let me just say, we have to stop here, but I'll just say them briefly. I mean, Taoism and I think Confucianism has been down to today, very focused on what they call li, order, rules, propriety in conduct, and it's in the Confucian tradition. This is associated with learning. You study books, you study the classics of Confucianism, and you also systematically study the behavior of individuals in history. Like, you study Clinton and the Monica Lewinsky, you study, Iran-Contra, you study how people behaved, and you get good and bad moral examples, and then you look at your friends and you observe their behavior, and you say, oh yeah, I'd like to be more like how that person was, and I'd like to be less like that person. So you're always like learning things, and the purpose of learning is not knowledge gathering, it's character formation, to make yourself into a more moral person, and that starts with following rules that are passed down. Like don't chew with your mouth open. And you don't even have to know why, just don't do it. And then maybe when you're 60, you'll come to understand, and it'll be spontaneous for you to be out of consideration for other people to do this, and you won't even have to think about the rules. But when you're 14, just start with the rules, and the idea is that eventually this will come to be able to act this way without worrying about the rules. But to start with, we have to study the rules and moral examples and train ourselves. So I think of Confucianism and Taoism, if I put them over to our Buddhist, spectrum, Confucianism is like the Gelugpas, it's like the constructivists, it's like Theravada, and Taoism is like Nyingma. Yeah. In that, not ultimately, but like on that spectrum, which is, okay. Thank you.